all along. They've been wonderful for us. Jen Kelleher and Pata Suyamoto. They have been working together with the coalition. Jen is the managing director, and both Jen and Pata are part of our Alliance for Equity within the Mass Coalition for Suicide Prevention. Today's webinar series will be on widening the lens, shattering the filter of whiteness and suicide prevention. If folks have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat. We have somebody that will be checking those questions for you so that we can make sure that we ask the presenters when the time does come. So please feel free to just write in anything that you have. And we hope that you enjoy this series. I'm going to turn it over to Jen and Pata right now and let them take it away. Thank you for being here.
Kelly?
Yes.
Are we recording this?
We are not recording. Or are we recording? Laura?
We should be recording.
I am recording.
I see the little red button on.
Okay, sorry, I can't see anything. Thanks.
Thanks, Kelly. So as Kelly mentioned, for those of you who don't know me, I am Jen Kelleher. I'm the managing director of the MCSP. I've been with the coalition since 2012. And since 2017, I have been the chair of the White Ally Caucus and co-chair of the MCSP Alliance for Equity. And I'm also one of the co-authors of the Widening the Lens Racial Equity Toolkit. For those of you who aren't familiar with the coalition, the MCSP was founded in 1999 as a broad-based alliance of stakeholders, including representatives from state agencies, mental health consumers and providers, suicide loss and attempt survivors, families and individuals who have been impacted by suicidal behavior, and concerned individuals and organizations, all dedicated to working in partnership to reduce suicide and self-harm in Massachusetts, as well as mobilize a broad-based group of activists and leaders at the community level. And our mission is to prevent suicide through statewide collaboration and advocacy.
Hi, and I'm Pata Suyamoto, and I'm the co-chair of the Greater Boston Regional Suicide Prevention Coalition, the chair of the People of Color Caucus, and the co-chair of the MCSP's Alliance for Equity. I also serve on MCSP's executive committee. I am also one of the co-authors of Widening the Lens, exploring the role of social justice and suicide prevention. And I earned my PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and did my research on anti-racist education and issues of race and racism. I'm also a feminist scholar, writer, educator, diversity trainer, and mental health activist. The Alliance for Equity started in 2017 to inform the MCSP at all levels. The Alliance is comprised of the two caucuses mentioned, the People of Color Caucus and the White Ally Caucus. And although we do much of our work together, we do break into affinity groups as needed. Oops, sorry. All right. So I want to start by just showing the model of this window of tolerance. So normally when we're going along, hopefully for most of us, it's smooth sailing. And we carry on with our daily life feeling pretty well. However, when things get difficult or when we hear difficult information or challenging information, we may go into hyperarousal, which means that we might be emotionally overwhelmed or have a lot of anxiety, feel unsafe, or we can go into hypoarousal and feel numb with no feelings or energy. And we just want this model to present this model so you can be aware of how you're doing as we go through this material, because a lot of it is challenging and we're aware of that. So we get asked this question of why do this work in suicide prevention? Why use racial equity and social justice as a lens to do suicide prevention when the majority of people who die are white men? So first, suicide affects everyone. Suicide is a public health issue that doesn't discriminate, and any death by suicide is a tragedy. In addition, systems of oppression intersect with suicide and suicide prevention in a number of ways. Racism hurts people of color and white people, albeit differently. Racism increases the risk of mental health concerns and suicide for Black, Indigenous people of color, or BIPOC. Racism systemically disenfranchises, erases, and constrains people of color, which results in poor physical and mental health outcomes. Racism can give white people an unfair and unearned advantage, and the expectation that that advantage and privilege, and the belief that the advantage is deserved and the norm. It also limits white people's perspectives and behaviors. And if we elevate the situation of those who are most marginalized, then we may catch others who are falling through the cracks. And anti-racist work is suicide prevention. And from a social determinants of health perspective, we must look at racism as a factor for suicide.
So why focus on whiteness and social justice and equity and suicide prevention? it's really important to acknowledge that talking about things like systemic oppression, racism, white privilege, white supremacy culture can be really, really uncomfortable. It can bring up feelings of shame, anger, defensiveness, or a lot of other complicated and sometimes unfamiliar emotions. And I want to acknowledge that this isn't going to be an easy conversation. And for many white people, even hearing the words white supremacy culture can seem like a personal attack. But our intention today isn't to attack anyone, but rather to highlight the systems of oppression that we benefit from as white people, the white supremacy culture that protects us from harm while at the same time harming BIPOC, and to examine not only our own role as unwitting agents of systemic racism, but also how we can work to leverage our privilege to become agents in challenging and dismantling these systems and norms. So whether you've been doing this work for years or whether this is your first time considering issues of social justice, the fact that you're here is an indication of your willingness to work towards equity. And no matter how much time you've spent doing anti-racist work, there will be times when you feel like you're uncomfortable. There will be times when you feel like you have no idea what to do. And there will be times when you realize you've made mistakes. This is all part of the process. One of the reasons why we decided to do a webinar solely focused on whiteness is because when whiteness is viewed as the norm, it's not seen, it's not addressed, and it's not questioned or challenged. And today we're going to do those three things. And if you are white, this is likely going to challenge some of your perceptions and make you uncomfortable. And this is part of the work. This also, as white people, this is our responsibility. And for organizations in suicide prevention, we need to focus on equity because if we don't, we can't do effective suicide prevention work. And focusing on equity will help us reach more people and save more lives. So to be able to understand issues around equity, we also have to understand context and history, and a foundational understanding of how people's lives have been shaped by historical trauma and oppression. This is also part of the work and also integral to suicide prevention. So it's really important to acknowledge that the history that we think of as BIPOC history is also white history. We often speak of issues of racism as if it were only a matter of concern for BIPOC, but racism and white supremacy culture not only are in our history as white people, but also in the worlds we currently inhabit today. And as white people, we have to accept that they're our responsibility, not because we personally created them, but because we remain a part of the culture and systems that not only benefit us, but that we unwittingly help perpetuate. By framing BIPOC history as only relevant to these communities, we erase all responsibility for the white people who shaped that history, and also our own responsibility as white people who live in a culture and society shaped by that history. Our responsibility being to work to undo the legacy of that trauma. So the genocide of Indigenous people in this country at the hands of white colonizers is not just Indigenous history. It's also the history of the white oppressors who stole land and killed the people who are living here. Slavery is not just Black history. The history of slavery is not only that Black people were enslaved, but also that white people sold, enslaved, tortured, and killed Black people. The Japanese internment is also white history. It's not only the history of the families and individuals who were imprisoned, but also the policymakers who created the camps, the white people who guarded them, and the white people who stole Japanese-owned businesses and homes. And it's also important to note that in addition to the colonizers, the enslavers, and the people who created and maintained the internment camps, each of those moments in our history includes the silence and complicity of many, many white people who knew but said nothing. The history of segregation and redlining, voter disenfranchisement, the so-called war on drugs, and the mass incarceration of BIPOC are all things that we as white people bear responsibility for. Again, not because we personally created the systems of oppression that caused these things, but because they are all direct results of white supremacy culture, which we all benefit from, and unless we do the work, all unwittingly perpetuate. And so if all those things are white history, and in some cases, parts of our history we have by no means left behind, then we have to hold our society accountable, not only for the legacy of trauma created by those events, but the continued oppression that has resulted from them. The current imprisonment and deplorable treatment of refugees in our country, including children, toddlers, and infants, is not only part of the story of immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers, but it's also the story of the people who enacted these cruel policies, the individuals who enforced them, and the larger white society that is complicit in accepting these atrocities. Because it is also our story as white people, it is our responsibility. The current landscape of police brutality is not just a Black issue. It's about the often, but not exclusively, white police who commit these crimes, as well as the police who rush to defend their actions. It's about the legal system that protects this brutality as somehow justified and ensures that few, if any, of these officers will face real consequences. But it's also about the white people who are silent, who repost a meme or a photo and move on. But It's also the story of the people, BIPOC and white people, who are protesting, who are demanding change. It's also the story of how we resist. And it can become the story of how we work to create systemic change. But in order for that to happen, white people need to understand, acknowledge, and take responsibility for our role in working to shape that change. So why should white people do this work? Whether it's history, current events, or even just our own personal or professional contexts, it takes a lot of effort to see that there are lenses through which we as white people have been brought to see or not see how the world works. It takes effort to understand that there isn't any such thing as neutral, and that what is presented as objective or rational or the status quo is often just another way of not saying that these are structures and norms that support and continue to advantage people with the most access to power. And this is true for race, gender, religion, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, gender identity, and many more things. We're taught that the default is white, straight, Christian male, and that people of color, women, religious minorities, or LGBT individuals are other. And anything that addresses the needs and concerns of any of these subgroups is then deemed identity politics. But there's also an identity politics behind the advantaging of white, straight Christian men. We have just been taught not to see it. And in this framing, we are overtly and covertly given the message that identity politics are the interest and responsibility of the individuals who are disadvantaged, not the people who are part of the systems that oppress them. But it's equally, if not more important, that those of us who are in positions of power accept that it's also our work to create systemic change. And this is especially true in the field of suicide prevention, which has historically been and continues to be predominantly white. We spoke to this in our first webinar, but to reiterate, once we recognize that issues of oppression are also the responsibility of the people in power and the people who benefit from these systems, it becomes clear that white people as allies need to work both personally and professionally, not only to dismantle systems of oppression that we unjustly benefit from and protect us while harming others, but to also follow the leadership of BIPOC with respect to our goals around racial equity within our organizations and communities. And that's both in terms of what that racial equity looks like and also what changes need to happen to actually reach that equity. As allies, we can speak to the resistance of other white people at the table because as white people, we ourselves have been and still are confronting our own blind spots and our own resistance, and we have some understanding of what it's like. And because of systemic racism, the unfortunate reality is that especially within predominantly white organizations, white people not only systemically but institutionally have more power, and therefore as allies, we can and need to leverage that power to engage everyone in our organizations around issues of racial equity and social justice. And as white people, we can also do that with minimal risk. So because of all this, when we began this work as a coalition, we knew it was crucial for white allies to work in collaboration with BIPOC, both as an acknowledgement of our responsibility to do the work, and also as an acknowledgement that this emotional and mental labor should not fall solely on BIPOC. We agreed from the outset that both the People of Color Caucus and White Ally Caucus that formed the Alliance for Equity were necessary pieces of a whole, that we would work collaboratively and that we had to do the work together. Part of our work as white allies is owning our responsibility to be actively engaged in anti-racist efforts. Because we're the ones who benefit from systemic racism that harms BIPOC, because we're the ones who knowingly or unknowingly uphold the systems and institutional norms that perpetuate oppression, because we have more power to leverage, we can't ignore that it's not only our role, but our moral responsibility to examine, question, and restructure inequitable systems where we can. And we also can't ignore the fact that it is our responsibility and moral obligation in doing that to always align our efforts with the leadership, goals, and strategies of BIPOC communities and individuals that we're doing the work with.
So I want to speak to the to why being colorblind or saying I don't see color is a problem. First, it's not true because as humans we categorize people by our nature. Saying I'm colorblind is actually racist, as it erases the experience of BIPOC, invalidates experience of racism, and justifies white people's ignorance or complicity. It's an excuse to not have to think about these things, and it does so while maintaining a sense of moral superiority. It's a misdirection in that racism is individual and not systemic, and denies the existence of white privilege. Given these things, it's a construct that doesn't move the conversation forward. It actually stops conversation. And it perpetuates the myth of a post-racial society. And given that we're not in a post-racial society, we need to consider how our what our racial identities mean to us, and consider how they are developed. To think about white identity development, we are going to consider Janet Helms's model for white racial identity. So this model comes from the psychology and therapy literature and was developed by Janet Helms. It's important to realize that this model not only really looks at the individual level, as opposed to cultural or systemic. It's also important to note that not all people go through all stages of this model, and it can be recursive in that people may move back and forth between stages depending on their life experiences. Also, this is just a model. Real life experience may not fit into it, and it doesn't always describe all the possibilities. That being said, we think it's helpful to present it here because it allows us insight into understanding white racial development, which can promote reflection on our experiences and the way that we interact with each other and the world. So stage 1 is contact. And in this first stage, individuals adhere to that colorblind motto I just spoke of. They see racial difference, but they don't find it salient. And in fact, they may feel that racism is propagated by the discussion and the acknowledgement of race as an issue. In this stage, there is no conscious demonstration of overt racism. And this seemingly non-racist position can cover unconscious racist beliefs. If the individual is confronted with real-world experiences or knowledge that uncovers the privileges of white skin, they may move into the next stage, the disintegration stage. In this disintegration stage, because the person has new experiences which confront his prior conception of the world, and because his conception is now challenged by this new information or experience, the person is often plagued with feelings of guilt and shame. And these emotions of guilt and shame can be modified when a person decides to channel these emotions into a positive way. But when these emotions continue to dominate, the person may move into the reintegration stage. And it's important to note too that stages can be skipped. So you can move from contact to pseudo-independence depending on what happens. I mean, from disintegration to pseudo-independence depending on what happens in your life. So in the reintegration stage, this stage is marked by a blame the victim attitude that is more intense than anything experienced in the contact stage. They may feel that although white people do have privileges, it's probably because they deserve and or earn them, and they feel that in some way superior to BIPOC. If the person is able to combat these feelings, they may be able to move on to the pseudo-independent stage. Stage 4 is a pseudo-independent stage, and this stage is the first positive racial identification. Although an individual in this stage does not feel white people deserve privilege, they look to people of color, not themselves, to confront and uncover racism. Some BIPOC may show approval of these efforts and comfort the person as these efforts validate the person's desire to be non-racist. And although this is a positive, and certainly more positive, white racial identity, the person does not have a sense of how they can be both white and non-racist together. Stage 5 is an immersion stage. And in this stage, a person makes genuine attempt to connect to their own white identity and to be anti-racist. So they go inward to do this. And then they come outward, and in this stage is also accompanied by a deep concern with understanding and connecting with other white people who have been dealing with these issues of racism. And the last stage is autonomy. And this stage is reached when an individual has a clear understanding of and a positive connection to their white racial identity, while also actively pursuing social justice. Helms is not talking about an identity that's based on white power or white supremacy. It's about understanding that understanding the lens of whiteness and its impact on the person themselves as well on BIPOC. It's an understanding that their positionality and the role of being anti-racist is part of that white identity. Helms' stages are about finding positive racial identification with being white and becoming an active anti-racist. So one of the things that when a white person particularly is in a disintegration stage that they can experience is this idea of shattered assumptions. And shattered assumptions is a term we often use in trauma response work. Experiencing a traumatic event often challenges our assumptions about the world in which we live and the people we know and sometimes even ourselves. A powerful recent example of shattered assumptions is the blatantly callous murders of Black people, particularly by police officers, that was captured on video for the world to see. Many people, especially white people, have been taught to assume that the police are there to protect and serve the community. The shattered assumption is the realization that this is not true for all people, and in fact, police can cause fear, harm, or even death. Exploring racial justice in America requires us to accept that some of our assumptions have not been true and are not true for all Americans.
So, excuse me, things that come up as we move through trying to reframe our worldview in the wake of the shattered assumptions that Pata just talked about might evoke feelings of defensiveness or anger in reaction to our concept of ourselves and our society being questioned or altered. And this is something that Robin DiAngelo terms white fragility. She writes, "White people in North America live in a social environment that protects and insulates them from race-based stress. This insulated environment of racial protection builds white expectations for racial comfort, while at the same time lowering the ability to tolerate racial stress, leading to what I refer to as white fragility. White fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. These moves include the outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation. These behaviors in turn function to reinstate white racial equilibrium." So white fragility is often the reason why conversations about systemic racism and white supremacy culture get derailed. The most insidious aspect of white fragility is it shifts the focus from racism and its impact on BIPOC to white discomfort at being held accountable for our own unwitting complicity in the racist structures that maintains white supremacy culture and the status quo. Now, for most people, that last sentence probably elicited some strong emotion, whether it was defensiveness, denial, confusion, shame, or even anger. Moving through these emotions as white people is critical in allowing ourselves to participate in anti-racist efforts without shifting the focus on ourselves or our own feelings of comfort or discomfort. It's also important to keep in mind that discomfort is not the same as being unsafe. And while being told that every white person in our society is unwittingly complicit in white supremacy culture, whether we want to be or not, is an incredibly difficult thing to hear, it's important that we recognize that discomfort for what it is and not conflate it with a sense of being threatened. Two important things to understand about white fragility. Your reactions and feelings are something that you need to process and move through, and that work is something that needs to be done with other white people and in a way that doesn't distract from the conversation at hand. Initially, confronting our own white fragility or defensiveness or shame or whatever other emotions might come up while we're doing this can be daunting, but it actually can be a relief to talk to other white people about these reactions. And it also can help build capacity for sitting with this kind of discomfort and having these kind of conversations, both of which are crucial to our anti-racist work and our personal growth as allies. It's also important to note that as white people, we can build our capacity for discomfort, and consequently, we can become better equipped to have these conversations around race, as well as to address our unwitting complicity in upholding these social structures that provide us with advantage and protect us from being unjustly treated based on our race. And the more we have these conversations, the more we learn, the more work we do, the easier it becomes to see the problem of racism and begin to understand white supremacy culture in its entirety and see how insidious and pervasive it is. The more work we do, the more we understand our discomfort can be instructive as well and can lead us to an anti-racist perspective, but only if we work through it. The more work we do, the more we're able to help other white people process the intensity of their emotions around race in the appropriate context, alleviating that burden from BIPOC and preventing the conversation around race from being recentered around white fragility, as well as helping other white people move forward in their understanding white identity development and equity work. And the more we learn to sit with our discomfort, the more we're able to have discussions about race and anti-racist efforts without either feeling personally attacked or feeling like we need to prove that we're one of the good white people. And the more we're able to focus instead on constructively understanding, questioning, and working to dismantle systemic racism and other forms of oppression.
So we wish at this point just want you to check in with your window of tolerance, and if you are feeling uncomfortable, take a breath, or if you're feeling okay, that's great. Just want people to be aware of how they're doing in this conversation.
So white supremacy culture is a historically based, institutionally perpetuated system of exploitation and oppression of continents, nations, and peoples of color by white people and nations of the European continent for the purpose of maintaining and defending a system of wealth, power, and privilege. White supremacy culture is systemic, interconnected, and impacts every aspect of our society and our lives. It's about the economy, it's about education, it's about the legal system, it's about where we live, what resources we have access to, and how we get to be defined by the people around us, as well as often how we define ourselves. And it also impacts mental and physical health, as well as access to appropriate care when necessary. In suicide prevention, we have to understand white supremacy culture as it impacts BIPOC and BIPOC communities, recognizing and addressing how it contributes to inequities and disparities in physical and mental health between white people and BIPOC. White supremacy culture must not only be understood in terms of the causes of mental illness and suicidality, but also in how approaches to mental health services and interventions are shaped. Unless we are aware of how white supremacy culture functions and actively work to dismantle and decolonize its impact on our institutions, our organizations, and our work, our approaches and services will never be as effective for BIPOC as they will be for white people. White supremacy culture perpetuates itself by creating the misconception that systems and structures are not impacted by racism. It perpetuates itself by obscuring the need for systemic change so systems remain unquestioned and unaltered. It perpetuates itself by reducing racist behavior to only the individual or interpersonal level and ignores the broader cultural, institutional, and systemic levels which have the most impact on maintaining power, privilege, and the status quo. White supremacy culture is about making people with privilege think that because we've worked hard for what we have, we must deserve it. And about encouraging the false narrative that because our hard work paid off, the people who have less must not have worked as hard as we did. White supremacy culture is about justification for systems that unfairly benefit some while unfairly harming others, and about making those benefits and harms as invisible and as personal as possible. It's about creating a narrative that both makes invisible and rationalizes existing power structures, for example, the myth of meritocracy in America. But above everything, white supremacy culture is about maintaining power for those who already have it and denying opportunity to those who don't. But white supremacy culture requires us to be unaware, silent, and unwilling to take action. And when we begin to identify and question the fundamental premise of white supremacy culture, and when we change the way we do things individually and organizationally, we can actually begin to undo some of the harmful ways these norms and practices shape our own and other people's lives. And when we understand and question why certain values, which we have subconsciously internalized and accepted as the norm, we understand why they are prioritized in our culture and our institutions, we can begin to make conscious, deliberate choices to behave in ways that actively reject white supremacy culture and promote norms and values that are better aligned with our equity efforts. And the more individual communities and organizations take the time, take the time to question and undo these harmful norms in response to an understanding of white supremacy culture, the more impact we'll all have.
So I'm now going to talk about some of the characteristics of white supremacy culture. These characteristics were identified by Kenneth Jones and Tima Oken in Dismantling Racism, a workbook for social change groups. The authors address not only characteristics of white supremacy culture, but also offer some solutions. As Jones and Oken elucidate, the characteristics listed below are damaging because they are used as norms and standards without being proactively named or chosen by the group. They are damaging because they promote white supremacy thinking. This is something we've been talking about throughout this entire webinar. The norms that go unquestioned or even unseen perpetuate the status quo, which in a society built on and continually shaped by racism means a culture of white supremacy. I want to go through a few of these norms, but encourage you to go back and read the full piece, which is available on the SURJ, S-U-R-J, Showing Up for Racial Justice website. So the first norm is perfectionism. They state that it is common to focus on what is wrong rather than cultivating an ability to identify, name, and appreciate what's right. In addition, there's little investment, time, energy, financial resources in reflecting on what can be learned by our mistakes, and little or no effort is made to improve the way we do things. They suggest instead to develop a culture of appreciation, to make sure people's time and efforts are recognized, and to develop a learning organization where it is expected that everyone will make mistakes, and those mistakes offer opportunities for learning. They suggest creating an environment that recognizes that even mistakes can sometimes lead to positive results. The next norm is a sense of urgency. This makes it more difficult to be truly democratic in an organization and to think thoughtfully and long-term about each decision being made. They suggest instead to create realistic work plans, to be realistic about how long things will take, and to be clear about how to make good decisions in an atmosphere of urgency. Power hoarding is another characteristic they identify. This means that power is seen as a limited quantity, and therefore there's little value in sharing power. People with power feel threatened by organizational change, and those wanting change and feel that those wanting change are misguided, inexperienced, or emotional. They suggest instead to examine what good leadership actually is, which includes empowering and developing the skills of others within the organization, and to understand that change and challenging the status quo can be productive and beneficial. Fear of open conflict is another attribute of white supremacy culture. This means that those in power within an organization fear conflict and attempt to avoid or ignore it, resulting in shifting the blame to anyone who raises an issue that causes discomfort, rather than examining the issue itself. There's an emphasis on being polite and equating raising difficult issues with being rude or disruptive. And they suggest instead understanding that conflict is inevitable and should be addressed, and that tone policing should be avoided when a difficult issue is raised. A right to comfort is another attribute. This means that those in power believe that they have a right to emotional and psychological comfort, which can manifest in valuing logic over uncomfortable emotions and blaming those who cause discomfort and equating individual and interpersonal acts of racism with systemic and institutional racism. They suggest instead understanding that discomfort is necessary for growth, and that it's important for those in the dominant group to not take everything personally, and to approach anti-research with a deeper understanding of racism and oppression. And finally, the attribute of defensiveness. This means that the organizational structure is set up and much energy is spent to protect power as it exists, rather than to facilitate the best out of each person, or to clarify and be transparent about who has power and how they are expected to use it. Because of either or thinking, criticism of those with power is viewed as threatening and inappropriate or rude. People respond to new and challenging ideas with defensiveness, making it very difficult to raise these ideas. A lot of energy in the organization is spent trying to make sure that people's feelings aren't getting hurt or working around defensive people. The defensiveness of people in power creates an oppressive culture. And they suggest instead that people understand that structure cannot, and in and of itself, facilitate or prevent abuse, and that people need to understand the link between defensiveness and fear of losing power, losing face, losing comfort, or losing privilege. They suggest to work on our own defensiveness and name defensiveness as a problem when it is one. They suggest giving people, including ourselves, credit for being able to handle more than we think, and discuss the ways in which defensiveness or resistance to new ideas gets in the way of the mission. So again, just asking you to just check in with how you're doing, how you're feeling, your window of tolerance.
So one way that power structures continually reinforce power for those who already hold it is by defining what is valued as cultural capital. And cultural capital is a term that was introduced by Pierre Bourdieu in reference to symbols, ideas, tastes, and preferences that can be strategically used as resources in social action. And he sees this cultural capital as an embodied socialized tendency or disposition to act, think, or feel in a certain way. And cultural capital can be turned into, for example, educational capital, economic capital, and they reinforce each other. So as white people, we assume that the predominant cultural capital, including cultural norms, will be familiar to us, will be easy for us to navigate, and will generally work in our favor. It can also generally be assumed that the things we have been taught to value are the things that are also valued as part of the status quo, not only making it easier for us to interact with institutions and systems around us, but also making the existence of hegemonic white cultural capital normative and invisible. For example, I can be reasonably certain that when I walk into a social or professional setting, the linguistic norms are going to match those that I'm familiar and comfortable with. I can also be reasonably certain that what is valued in terms of cultural capital in art, literature, movies, the fine arts, will be the things that I've already been exposed to and I'm familiar with. And I can also be reasonably certain that structural norms, things like meeting agendas, memos, will also have been taught to me either through education or work experience. Also, white people can be reasonably certain that if we do deviate, either by accident or by choice, from these norms, it will be more accepted, and it will be thought of more as an individual preference rather than not understanding, not getting it, or not fitting in, which is often not so subtly coded language to encourage assimilation and embracing of the status quo at the expense of one's own culture, norms, comfort, or identity. And unless a particular norm stands in conflict with one of our identities where we experience oppression, it will be more likely to be attributed to our personality rather than our identity. And will likely be less pressure to conform to norms that don't work for us, because as white people, we already are seen as embodying the dominant cultural norms.
So one of the dilemmas for BIPOC is assimilation. BIPOC are often confronted with sometimes invisible dilemma in that we have to choose whether we assimilate into the dominant culture and conform to the dominant norms and therefore get the cultural capital that we are allowed to, or be excluded from the benefits of mainstream society. One way BIPOC deals with this conflict is to learn to code switch, which means in this context, learning to speak and act in accordance with the norms of the dominant culture while maintaining one's own language and switching between the two to survive. For example, BIPOC are encouraged and sometimes forced to learn standard English in school to find a job or to get into college. This is mostly not discussed as a choice, in that to succeed in school, you must learn standard English without question. Teachers don't generally say, I'm teaching you standard English as a way to provide you with the cultural capital to participate in the dominant culture. And even if BIPOC do assimilate and learn to code switch, this does not protect us from racism and its impact. And code switching is not without emotional labor, in that to do this, one not only has to split one's identity, but it also means you have to be hypervigilant in relation to the dominant culture and its ideals.
So what does it mean to have a white identity? When unpacking what it means to have a white identity, it can be helpful to acknowledge that none of us chose the racial identity we were born into. And although it isn't our fault that we have been born white in a culture of white supremacy that harms BIPOC while protecting us, and it's not our fault that our culture provides us with advantages while providing fewer opportunities and less protections for BIPOC, it is our responsibility as we become aware of systemic racism and its impact to work to challenge inequity within ourselves, our communities, and our organizations. White is actually not an identity in and of itself. Rather, it's a powerful racial construct that's evolved over time to protect the power of the people with mostly European ethnicity. If we are white, whiteness is often erased or minimized our ethnic and cultural identity and attributes, and we may not have a strong connection with our identity as it relates to our ethnicity. Having a white identity in a white supremacy culture makes that identity invisible and seamless. It isn't something that most of us have ever had to think about or question. It isn't something that has restricted us or defined who or how we are allowed to be in the world. For example, I am Italian and Irish American, and while I know some of my cultural background, my culture isn't the first thing that comes to mind when I think of who I am. While I'm connected to my cultural identities, I am much more connected with my identity as a woman. And I think that this is often easier to see and unpack oppressed identities as opposed to dominant identities, which are usually invisible until we do our work to make them visible. Partly this is because as a woman, I've been made acutely aware of how my experience based on gender deviates from the norm, or should I say from the identity group that wields the most social, institutional, and cultural power, men. It is sometimes easier to unpack these identities where we experience oppression. And so unpacking identities as white people is uncomfortable work because it means understanding and questioning our privilege, as well as our unwitting complicity in racism and white supremacy culture. It means acknowledging that these things have shaped us in ways we don't want and don't necessarily even want to acknowledge to ourselves. But if we want to do anti-racist work and if we want to be allies, we need to acknowledge and examine our whiteness and what it means, including all of the aspects of whiteness that make us uncomfortable. And when we examine and we question our whiteness as a lens, we can begin to unpack the ways in which the norms of white supremacy culture have been passed on to us. Perfectionism, sense of urgency, power hoarding, fear of open conflict. When we begin to see these things for what they are, which is a specific and cultured way of interacting with ourselves and the world around us, we can also begin to question whether these norms we have been taken for granted really make sense, whether they work for us as well as for the people who aren't white, and whether what we can do to find different norms that fit ourselves, the people around us, and our organizations and communities better. In suicide prevention, this means we have to acknowledge that as a field, like everywhere else, has a tendency to see white as the default. And we also have to recognize that a lot of awareness efforts, interventions, and services are not created in a way that is culturally relevant for BIPOC. We have to understand and acknowledge that unless we are willing to stop using whiteness as the default, our efforts will never reach BIPOC communities in the way we want them to. To work towards equity and creating truly culturally responsive approaches to suicide prevention, it isn't enough to just examine the way service delivery and awareness efforts are structured. We also have to examine our organizations for characteristics of white supremacy culture, power hoarding, fear of open conflict, sense of urgency, and also ask ourselves whether the norms we operate under are beneficial or detrimental to our work and our evolution institutionally and organizationally. We have to consider other approaches and prioritizing other values and norms which may be unfamiliar to us, but may ultimately be more impactful and have a broader reach across many communities.
So understanding whiteness as a person of color, people of color are always aware that we are different than the dominant culture. We are told we don't belong, and this is reinforced by the conscious and unconscious behavior of white people, dominant education, and historical whitewashing. BIPOC are often trying to de-escalate situations and appease the dominant culture. We anticipate pushback or confrontation. We use strategies such as apology, code switching, and assimilation when possible to accommodate white people to survive in white supremacy culture. We are always thinking about impact. This de-escalation results in minimizing ourselves, and not doing this could result in consequences that could be deadly. Whiteness is continually being reinforced as a norm, and white supremacy culture defines how we're supposed to act to be normal, even if that compromises our own cultural norms and identity. Whiteness is characterized by entitlement, things like speaking over BIPOC or white-splaining. For example, a white person with no knowledge in a field explains to a person of color with extensive knowledge in the same field about a subject in that field. And it's the assumption that white people's ideas are valued and heard. And there's an assumption that the competence of white people, rather than the assumption that BIPOC are not competent, unless a competence is part of a stereotype, such as Asian Americans are good at math. We are allowed to be good at math, but not expected to be brilliant writers of poetry in English. And how does this relate to suicide prevention? If we're doing suicide prevention in communities of color and we're using white norms, then we're not going to reach the community because we're not culturally humble. We can't do a one-size-fits-all, and that's what we've done. And this has been based on the idea that there is a norm, which is really just a lens of whiteness.
So white privilege is often very misunderstood. Having white privilege doesn't mean you've lived a privileged life. It just means that of all of the things making your life difficult, your race hasn't been one of those things. You can have white privilege and be the target of other forms of oppression like sexism, religious discrimination, homophobia, transphobia, ableism. White privilege means that all other things being the same, your experience compared to the other experience of someone who shares all of your other identities except for race will generally mean you have been protected from experiencing additional hardships and have had additional advantages. White privilege is a set of systemic advantages we've been given without having done anything to deserve them, and that can impact every aspect of our lives, including employment, education, access to housing, fairer treatment in the criminal justice system, and even access to appropriate physical and mental health services. And this isn't to say people with privilege haven't worked to get where they are. Most of us have. But we also have to acknowledge the very real advantages we've been given along the way. We have to recognize that having white privilege means that our hard work is much more likely to result in the successes that are proportional to our efforts. And this is often not true for BIPOC. Whether our advantages come in the form of education, networking, a shared understanding of cultural capital, or even just being given the benefit of the doubt and being assumed to be competent. While we've had to work hard to get where we are, we haven't been dragged down by racial inequity along the way. And again, people don't only have one identity. So you can have white privilege, but socioeconomic disadvantage. And some of these advantages may apply more to some people than others. But just the fact of being white, we do have advantages that BIPOC do not have. Types of privilege include, but are not limited to, economic privilege. So having access to higher paying jobs, loans, credit cards, and generational wealth. Physical privilege, being able to feel safe as we move about in the world. Emotional privilege, not having to deal with constant microaggressions, and also access to culturally relevant support services. Educational privilege, access to and ability to pay for education. Structural privilege, being surrounded by systems and structures that reflect the norms we have been taught to value. Cultural privilege, being able to assume that we will see ourselves reflected back in cultural spaces, such as art, music, literature, movies. And finally, institutional privilege, the expectation that people in positions of power are also likely to look like us and to prioritize the same norms that we have been taught to value. And until we recognize and work to dismantle the systems that uphold our white privilege, we will not live in a racially equitable society, and our work in suicide prevention will not be as impactful as it could.
So we want to talk a little bit about white allyship, and this is a little review from the last webinar. So allyship is one of the most important pieces of social justice and racial equity work that white people can do. Being an ally is not passive. Action, and that is continual, informed, collaborative, and always connected to the goals and needs of communities of color, is constantly required if you're going to be true allies, rather than just play lip service to allyship. Allies need to be committed to being upstanders rather than bystanders, which means that you need to be willing to challenge a racist remark or behavior. And that not only includes overtly racist comments or behaviors, but also more subtle microaggressions. and even behaviors or statements that upholds the status quo, which is systemic racism. And you need to be able to do this both in your personal and professional lives. And it's not, but it is just as, if not more important, that in becoming upstanders, you do not take away the agency of BIPOC in the room to address the situation directly as I want to, speaking up, but not over. Because so much of allyship is nuanced, respectful, direct, and open communication with BIPOC is essential. However, as allies, you need to be respectful of the emotional labor it can take for BIPOC to engage in some of these discussions and be clear that you're willing to have these conversations on the terms of people of color when and if they are ready. As part of communicating through this process, it's important that white people are willing to not only receive feedback, but to examine your own behaviors, statements in response to the feedback you receive. It's important that people of color are aware that you're willing to do that. The most important thing when receiving feedback is to listen and accept the reality that the BIPOC is presenting to you. When you get defensive or express it wasn't your intent to harm, you undermine not only the impact of your words and actions have had, but also the very real pain of the person of color who is articulating to you what that impact was. You're also effectively gaslighting people of color by denying our ability to tell our own narrative and to have the ownership of our own experiences. Instead, you need to listen, accept that you have hurt this person and how, and figure out how to do better. Also, as allies, you need to be willing to take personal and professional risks in voicing your opinions, in elevating the voice of BIPOC, and in advocating for organizational commitment to this work, including necessary structural changes that will actually move our organizations toward equity. You have to be willing to encounter and face resistance head on, even if that means you may be seen as strident or difficult or even face professional or personal backlash. So common pitfalls of white allyship are: one is a lack of accountability. Not owning mistakes and not taking responsibility and growing from them is a common ally mistake. To focus on intent rather than impact when you've said or done something hurtful. When you try to defend or explain away your mistakes, not only do you tell the BIPOC you've harmed that our pain is less important than your intentions, which it isn't, but you also miss an opportunity to learn for what you've done wrong, hold yourself accountable, and become stronger allies. Ally exceptionalism is another pitfall. Working harder to prove you're one of the good white people than you do at systemically dismantling racism within our organizations, our relationships, or ourselves is exceptionalism. This is incredibly important because while you can and should grow as allies, when you focus on proving your own lack of complicity, you again recenter the conversation around white people and also ignore or dismiss the broader experiences of BIPOC, as well as your own role in unwittingly maintaining structural racism. And you miss an opportunity to dismantle your own behaviors, thoughts, etc., that contribute to that complicity. Ally savior complex is another, thinking that your role is to come in and save people and communities of color. And this can be more insidious. In your eagerness to do the work, you can get carried away and push too hard for what you think the solution should be, rather than follow the leadership of BIPOC and BIPOC communities. As white people, you are not coming to rescue BIPOC. You are taking ownership and responsibility for your complicity in the harm that has been caused by structural racism and white supremacy culture, and working in partnership with us and communities of color to do as much as you can to undo structural and systemic racism that gives you an unfair advantage and harms BIPOC. Taking over or versus taking the lead from BIPOC. As white people, you must follow the lead of BIPOC, not only in setting goals around what equity looks like in our work in our organizations and communities, but also what steps need to be taken in order to make ourselves and our communities more equitable, and what benchmarks we need to meet to ensure that we're making progress we want to be making. Lack of communication is not maintaining direct, open, and honest channels of communication with BIPOC you're doing this work with, and not asking BIPOC with whom you're doing this work how they want you to act as an ally, reveals this lack of communication. Not talking to white people as appropriate as part of this process. You need to take the role of educating other white people about things like white privilege, allyship, white supremacy culture, so BIPOC don't have to. And answering basic questions for other white allies is also part of your role. Centering yourself in the conversation, and this can take on many forms, from ally exceptionalism to white fragility, to simply redirecting the conversation away from the topic at hand, to asking BIPOC to help you understand a concept you're having trouble with. These types of conversations are better had at a different time, and after you've done some research to educate yourself on the topic in question. Centering yourselves in a conversation can also mean expecting BIPOC to do emotional labor for you, such as educating you about something you don't understand, reassuring you that you're not a bad white person, or asking us to explain our painful lived experience for your own edification. Although some BIPOC may be willing to have these educative conversations, it cannot be assumed that all BIPOC will. And even BIPOC who are willing, you need to ask about our bandwidth before you proceed. And lastly, selective or performative allyship. And the selective or performative ally might repost or even post anti-racist information and articles on social media, sign petitions, etc. But they do not do the hard work of the hard internal, systemic, and structural work to truly undo white supremacy and racism. A selective performative ally only engages around issues of racial equity when it's convenient for them or when they feel like it. True allyship requires consistency, risk-taking, and integrating social justice and racial equity as much as we can into every aspect of our lives and our work.
So my call to action for everyone listening today is to understand that as white people, we have a responsibility and a moral obligation to do this work, even especially the parts of the work that are uncomfortable. And I encourage us to do that by learning how to be uncomfortable and sit with that discomfort. Be prepared to make mistakes and examine our mistakes with enough humility to be able to learn from them. Working to expand and shift our understanding of what racism and oppression are and how they manifest, and beginning to look at racism as structural, institutional, and social, rather than just individual or interpersonal. And understanding that as white people, we all benefit from structural racism, and we have a responsibility to acknowledge, challenge, and work to undo these oppressive social structures. Questioning institutional, cultural, and social norms, why they exist, who they serve, and what might function better within our organizations to promote equity and elevate the voices of BIPOC and other people whose voices and perspectives aren't generally elevated. Being prepared for the fact that this work is ongoing and doesn't have an endpoint. Being prepared also for our own and other people's resistance. And finally, holding ourselves accountable for our mistakes, for our blind spots, for our responsibility to continually educate ourselves, to do the work, and to bring an anti-racist lens to everything we do, both personally and professionally.
And I believe that if we are invested in suicide prevention, we must also be invested in shifting the narrative around suicide and fighting for racial equity on all levels of our work and society. I also believe that when white people can be strong allies for BIPOC, we can work together to dismantle white supremacy culture and examine the norms and structures within our field. It's critical we all work on our own blind spots when it comes to oppressive systems, and we all have them. We must work on being allies when we have personal, cultural, institutional, and structural privileges. We must be cognizant of this privilege and leverage it to make space for the voices and concerns of people who are oppressed. As BIPOC, we must find ways to be empowered, speak out, and demand a voice in the work of suicide prevention, as suicide affects our lives and communities as well. None of us can do this work in isolation. We need each other to make an impact. The first step is to deeply understand how we are positioned and what it means for our lives and our work. Unpacking how whiteness works in our society and its impact on BIPOC is part of that work. Finally, this work is continuous. As Jen said, there's no end point. And as it is a process of learning and acting and learning again. Our commitment to this process is critical for change to occur. And I am hopeful that we will see real changes and progress in my lifetime. The time to act is now. And I ask you to join me and us in working together to make a more equitable and just society. So now we have time and for questions. And probably the best thing to do is to put them in the chat. I guess, yeah, because we have a number of people here. So I hope that that people have some questions or some thoughts, and we encourage you to ask them. Sure. The question is, would you please explain the code switching? So code switching is basically the use of two languages or dialects, or, and switching between the two of them. But in this context, it really means using the language of the dominant culture, which generally is standard English, and having the language of a home culture, or of your for people of color, or or immigrants too, who have a language that is not standard English. So the switching happens because when you're at home, or you're with your friends, or you use one set of linguistic norms, and then when you are dealing with a dominant culture, you use standard English, or the dominant culture's language. Now, the thing about that is that often this is not seen as something that's a choice. It has more to do with surviving in the dominant culture, because the dominant culture is going to looks down upon the language that you might use at home, or the language of the person of color. Jen, do you want anything to add to that, or?
Just I think for frame of reference, it's sort of like you have a professional language and a language you use in your social life. I think the difference is that for BIPOC, code switching involves much more of an erasure of identity when you have to code switch.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Susan, part of a dual identity.
Yes. Okay, should I just read this? I think that this work is very important, and it was a good presentation. Oops. Okay, hold on. Sometimes I don't know what I should do to contribute. I do share my thoughts and challenge racism or racist ideas when I hear them, but I do not always feel that this is enough. I also try to educate myself and ensure everyone I supervise feels supported and that they have equal opportunities. Jen, do you want to?
I think that we all feel like we could be doing more. I know I do. I think that my strategy is to just do better than yesterday. And what I've seen throughout the course of this work at the coalition is the incredible growth amongst our executive committee members, in our general membership, in our Alliance for Equity, by making those small steps. If you start by speaking out when you feel comfortable, you'll find that you'll feel more comfortable to speak out in more situations. It will eventually become second nature. And then I think it just sort of goes from there. And also I would say that educating yourself and making sure that everyone you work with and supervise feels supported is also a great step.
And I think educating oneself takes many forms.
Yes.
It takes the forms of, reading more, conversing more, asking questions more. It really is about, it's about a perspective toward learning, I think, about these issues that it sounds like, you're working on, and I think that are from, and I think that that education, like we said, is really ongoing.
So Susan, yes, we can read the call to action before we close out. So the next question is, as an aspirational white ally, I want to use whatever resources I have to stay motivated, but some of those resources can send me into a mode of exceptionalism, and I think I'm great because I'm doing this. Can you speak to how we can balance our own internal motivations, feelings of doing good while being a less conspicuous anti-racist? I think you've actually hit the nail on the head in the question itself. I think the problem with ally exceptionalism is when we need to externalize and have validation for the work we're doing. I know I am very proud of the coalition. I'm very proud of the toolkit. I'm very proud of the Alliance. I think the problem is when that becomes the focus, and when it starts to become when it when that becomes the lens through which you're seeing everything. Pada, do you want to?
Yeah, I also think that being, you know, if we really kind of embrace the fact that this is a continuous thing, none of us are ever done, right? So, I think we can. I don't think it's personally, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to feel like, okay, I'm trying to do this good. I mean, but to think that you've done it and you're done and you can, you are now like you're dubbed anti-racist or something like
Yes.
that becomes the problem. So, I mean, there's always something more to learn.
Absolutely.
And I think if we keep that humble approach to learning, then we realize that, oh, okay, so I've learned this and I've spoken up in this way and I've learned about allyship and there's more to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's key, Pada, the humility and the continually learning and knowing there's more to do. We'll be talking more about white supremacist culture and the mental health system and examples of how it impacts white people and BIPOC.
Well, I mean, I'm going to take that as a question. Like how does this work in the mental health system? I think, most of the ways that we deal with mental health are Eurocentric. So most of the ways that we deal in this culture with mental health have not been looked at through a cultural lens. And this is a problem, I believe. I mean, I use my own personal example. I'm a person who lived experience and was in the mental health system since I was 16 years old. And only in maybe 10 years ago did my therapist ask me how my culture affected my mental health. That's a little bit insane if you think about it. I mean, I come from a Japanese American background and my father was interned in the war. And so there's a lot of things going on there, but no one ever asked about it. So I think that one of the ways is silence. Is assuming that the way we do things is the right way, assuming that that it's neutral, and and that somehow that our approaches are neutral, and I don't believe they are. Now that's not to say that we need to throw everything out necessarily, but we just need to question what are we doing and how does BIPOC, what can we do to make this more culturally relevant and to BIPOC and BIPOC communities. I mean, there's, and part of it is asking and listening and having that cultural humility as a practitioner. And, I mean, I think that the systems of mental health also, they are normative in terms of white culture. The fact that we have the hierarchy, the doctor and the patient and all these kinds of things. So when we start questioning those and thinking about, well, does this serve us? I think that's when we start thinking about, well, how can we impact the mental health system that is also imbued in, with white supremacy culture.
The next question, I'm wondering what you suggested with a client who openly makes comments that are racist. It makes me feel very uncomfortable, but not sure it's my role to question where this comes from or make my client feel judged. That is an excellent question. Not being a practitioner, I don't know the ethical piece of it. So if somebody who is a clinician can type their response in the chat. I do know sometimes if I am having a difficult time confronting somebody who makes a directly racist comment, I sometimes pretend to not understand what they're saying. Wait, I don't mean, what did you say? Why, wait, what is that? And make them explain themselves. It's not always appropriate given the context or given the comment, but I think that sometimes that can help people as they're trying to explain or clarify, realize that it's kind of a messed up thing to be saying.
Also asking a question like, well, what do you mean? What do you like? It's sort of similar to what Jen's saying, but I think you can ask an even more pointed question, like, why do you think that if you weren't white, you wouldn't have a van or whatever? I'm not sure I understand the example, but I mean, just asking the question about why they feel that and think that. I think that can help a person see that. But it's also important to note that there are times when it makes sense not to go there. I think, and I mean, this is from a person who thinks it should be everywhere, but, but there are times and contexts where it doesn't really serve you or the person. Now, maybe there are ways to come back to this issue or something, but I also think it's really important to, you don't want to alienate a relationship in a context that, I guess what I'm saying is you have to meet people where they're at, and that sometimes it makes sense to overlook something and note it and maybe come back to it in a different context that might be less confrontational.
One response in chat is never get mad, use as a teaching moment.
Yes.
Any other answers to that question or any other questions?
Other questions that people might have or thoughts? Yes, it's difficult to confront anger or aggressive speech in the moment. I try to take a breath and take care of myself and then validate the emotion expressed. It's a person that I wanted to help, but I need to know that I'm safe doing that. And then it might be hard for me to listen. So I asked to stop yelling or calling me names. Yeah, I mean, I think it is difficult. And I mean, I don't, sometimes I think it sort of depends on the context of the interaction. So, I mean, if a white person is yelling at me, I think it would feel different to me, and I would feel very threatened and scared, and because I don't know what's going to happen, and I don't know if I stand up what's going to happen, and which might feel different to Jen being yelled at, by a person of color, although it's still uncomfortable. Her reaction might be very different than my reaction.
Absolutely. And I think other dynamics can change this, right? So if you're a woman interacting with a man and feel physically threatened, one of the things that I've read about bystander interventions, the first thing to do is make sure you feel safe and make sure any other person involved who's being targeted is safe. And that's the most important thing. But
Right.
yes, it is very difficult to confront anger or aggressive speech in the moment. The next question, oh, sorry.
Oh, you can go. Go ahead.
I was just going to move on to the next question. Do you have more
Sure.
on?
No, go ahead.
As a white clinical supervisor, do you recommend having this discussion with supervisees of color at the start of the supervisory relationship by asking, how does your culture impact your practice? Are there specific resources related to anti-racist clinical supervision? I think that would be a great start to the conversation.
Mm-hmm. I also think it's important to acknowledge, I mean, I don't know, you said you're a white clinical supervisor. I think it's also really to acknowledge that you understand your position too. As an educator, I wasn't a clinician, but as an educator, and I did a lot of anti-racist multicultural work in education, and I was a supervisor of student teachers, so there's a little bit of an analogy there. I would always note that I understood that my cultural perspective, I came from a particular cultural perspective, and that lens, that lens I bring to the work I do. And so understanding one's own position and being able to explain that and then asking, I think that makes a lot of sense. And specific resources related to anti-racist clinical supervision. I'm going to put my email here because I know someone, my sister who does this work, who's a clinician, a clinical professor would know. So if you want to email me, I can get some resources for you.
There's also a recommendation in the chat. Also circling back to the previous question, it's also okay to say you need to take some space and find someone else to talk to the person. I think, yes, absolutely. In terms of online arguments, there is a group on Facebook, I believe it's called
White Nonsense. Yeah.
Something like that. And they intervene, they prioritize intervening when BIPOC reach out to them. But they are white people trained to intervene in online arguments about racism, and they just come in and sort of have that argument for you. On the other hand, I found that as a white person, other white people grant me a certain status, even during conflicts. I have some space to work with that I know my BIPOC friends and community members don't have. It gives me a little motivation to try to use that status a bit, believing that I'm a slightly safer position. Absolutely. And I think that's something that is really critical to allyship. As Pat has said, acknowledging our position and not taking advantage of it, but at the same time, leveraging our privilege as white people to do things that are less risky for us than for BIPOC.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And as a person of color, giving, I mean, Jen has done this at meetings and things where she'll hand the floor over to me if there's resistance or something. You know, there's ways that you can elevate the voices of BIPOC in a way that that gives them space to speak. And so the way you leverage your privilege is also important.
Mm-hmm. And I think too that has to come with communication, right? So Pat and I have had a lot of conversations about how she would like me to act as an ally in certain situations. And I think it's helpful to have those conversations ahead of time before situations come up. Mm-hmm. So again, referring back to the communication Pat was talking about.
And we do, I mean, this work that we do is very intentional in how it's done. Mm-hmm. When we started the Alliance for Equity, it was very important to have a person of color caucus and a white ally caucus. And, you know, being able to understand what it means for each of these groups and how we can work together and how we can support each other. Mm-hmm. So what is the suicide rate of BIPOC youth compared to white youth? Do we have?
I'm not sure about that. And I think partly we don't know how accurate the data is in terms of BIPOC suicide deaths.
And how can people get involved in the Alliance for Equity? Well,
excellent question, Susan. Yeah. You can email Pata or myself. I'm going to put my
hold on, I'll put this. Don't we have? Yeah. We have our email here. That's our Alliance for Equity email. And I gave you people my personal email, and either one of those works. The toolkit is at masspreventsuicide.org in the resource section. And that is free and available in a downloaded form on the website.
Yes. Yes, and Kelly just linked to the most recent data as well in the chat.
Yeah. Are there other questions? We have a few more minutes for questions, and then we can redo our call to action to end us off. But
can we get copies of the slides? I believe so.
Yeah, we're actually gonna be probably posting this to YouTube, so that's our hope. So yes, but yes, you can get copies of the slide. Just email one of us and we'll send you copies. Anyone else? I always joke that in education, this is wait time, right? You wait and see if anyone has any questions. So let's do it. Jen and I will reread our call to action, and then we'll close out. Jen, go ahead.
All right. So as white people, I believe we have a responsibility to do this work, especially the parts of it that are really uncomfortable. And I encourage us to do that by learning how to be uncomfortable and how to sit with that discomfort, to learn how to be humble enough to examine our mistakes and learn from them, to shift our understanding of racism and oppression and how they manifest, and look at racism as structural, institutional, and social rather than just individual or interpersonal. Understand that as white people, we all benefit from structural racism and have a responsibility to acknowledge and challenge and work to undo oppressive social structures. Question institutional, cultural, and social norms, question why they exist, question who they serve, and question might function better within our organizations to promote equity and elevate the voices of BIPOC and other groups whose voices and perspectives aren't traditionally elevated. Be prepared for the fact that this work is ongoing. It doesn't have an endpoint. We're always learning. We're always trying to do better. And also be prepared for our own and other people's resistance. And finally, hold ourselves accountable for our mistakes, blind spots, and our responsibility to continually improve and educate ourselves, do the work, and to bring an anti-racist lens to everything we do, both personally and professionally.
And my call to action is, I believe that if we are invested in suicide prevention, we must also be invested in shifting the narrative around suicide and fighting for racial equity on all levels of our work in society. I also believe that when white people can be strong allies for BIPOC, we can work together to dismantle white supremacy culture and examine the norms and structures within our field. It's critical that we all work on our own blind spots when it comes to oppressive systems, and we all have them. We must work on being allies when we have personal, cultural, institutional, and structural privileges. We must be cognizant of this privilege and leverage it to make space for the voices and concerns of people who are oppressed. As BIPOC, we must find ways to be empowered to speak out and demand a voice in the work of suicide prevention, as suicide affects our lives and communities as well. And none of us can do this work in isolation. We need each other to make an impact. The first step is to deeply understand how we are positioned and what it means for our lives and our work. Unpacking how whiteness works in our society and its impact on BIPOC is part of that work. Finally, as Jen pointed out, this work is continuous. There is no endpoint, as it is a process of learning and acting and learning again. Our commitment to this process is critical for change to occur, and I am hopeful that we will see real changes and progress in my lifetime. The time to act is now. And I ask you to join me in working to make an equitable and just society. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, and we would love if people were interested in joining the Alliance. We meet typically the first Monday of every month virtually by Zoom. We've been meeting during the pandemic at 5 when people are going to and from their jobs. We typically meet at 5:45. Our next meeting will be the second Monday in August. And you can email me to get on the White Ally Caucus list and Pata to get on the People of Color Caucus list. And we will give you information about our next meeting.
And we thank everybody for joining us today. If you're interested in more of our trainings or webinars, just keep a lookout. Now that you've attended this series, you will be getting emails from AdCare, Laura Guida, with any upcoming trainings and webinars that we'll be having. So thank you so much for joining us. And Jen and Pata, once again, thank you for a really great webinar.
Hey, Kelly,
yeah.
Do you know the date of Shelby's? Shelby, I just want to do a shout out.
I do. I'm so excited about this one. We have Wednesday, August 26th, also at 3 o'clock, we'll have Shelby Rowe, who is from Oklahoma and will be one of our presenters. She actually joined us here today. So we're really looking forward to having Shelby come and join us.
Great. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a wonderful night.
Thank you all.
Thank you.